Rotation has finally hit, and it is time to learn how to play Dragapult. Dragapult is by far the best deck in the game right now. It has a 30% usage rate in Japan before the Mega Spinner set came out, which is the current format we are in with the perfect order. So Dragapult is in a great position, and it's not just one Dragapult. Pre-rotation, we only had one Dragapult. We only had to worry about Dragapult Noir. Post-rotation, there is many. And today we're going to be taking a look at the 3 best ones that, well, I think are the best. Before we do continue though, I have a full guide on all 3 of the decks we're going to be looking at today, and I will leave the link down below. In the guide, we look at matchups for all 3 decks. It's around 100 pages of notes and matchups and everything you need to know. I go super in-depth on all of the lists. I go in-depth on the guides, what you should price check, what you should be benching in the matchups, notes for those matchups, and also the general game plan for a lot of the different matchups. I will be updating the guide as more and more matchups I understand. Then I'll be adding, every time I understand a matchup, I will be adding it to the guide. I will leave a link down below. It's $15 for basically 3 guides in one, because we go over Straight Pult, we go over Pult Noir, and also Terrapult as well. So anyway, to the video. So Dragapult pre-rotation was already really good, but post-rotation it becomes an even bigger threat due to its biggest ops getting rotated. Goldengo and God of War were the only 2 decks, in my opinion, keeping this deck in a real check, right? Like, you had a way to beat Dragapult. Post-rotation, though, I think a lot of its biggest, like, predators are basically different Dragapult versions, and we're going to be looking at which I think is the best Dragapult version for the mirror match very shortly. So today we're going to be taking a look at Terrapult, Straight Pult, and Pult Noir. Notable things about post-rotation Dragapult is that it is a lot more aggressive, adopting a much more aggressive playstyle as cards like Countercatcher and Iono rotate. So playing from behind is nowhere near as valuable as it was beforehand, but that doesn't mean playing from behind is completely dead as a way to win the game, because Dragapult still wants to avoid some certain things in the current meta. So post-rotation, a big shift for a lot of decks is, you know, due to the lack of disruption. Iono is gone, so a lot of decks are adapting Unfair Stamp as their main ace pick. And Unfair Stamp states that you can only use it if your opponent took a knockout on the previous turn. So Dragapult is one of the only decks that can spread damage without actually taking the prize cards. You know, it can swing into something, spread some damage, and not take a prize card. And on the following turn, it can do the exact same thing, and then it can close out the game with a 3rd Phantom Dive, you know, knocking out all of the things that were already damaged. And this is really important for one of 2 major reasons. One, you avoid the Unfair Stamp, because the stipulation for Unfair Stamp is that your opponent had to take a knockout on the previous turn. And it also prevents your opponent from drawing cards with Pheasantipity, because you can only use Pheasantipity when your opponent takes a prize card. So Dragapult is one of the only decks that you can kind of, play around these 2 really strong meta-defining cards. So let's take a look at Straight Dragapult. This is one of the versions of Straight Dragapult that I have been looking at. I have really been enjoying this deck. One main thing that you might realize is that this deck plays both Psyduck and Shaman. However, these are both in the deck as kind of like a placeholder. I think both of these slots are very swappable. Cards that you could include would be the Moltres, Ursaluna. You can see Ursaluna is a lack of in this deck, and these are just cards that are kind of like very meta dependent, depending on what is really good in the current meta or wherever you live, because obviously in different areas and regions there are very big divides in what decks are played there. So optional text I will leave over here on the screen, and I should probably add the Moltres as well. But yes, Moltres. But yeah, those are the optional techs in my opinion. Maractus / Yveltal, I would say, because, there's no Turo or Penny in the format, so Retreat Lock does become a much more viable strategy now. And yeah, this idea is still the same as Straight Pult pre-rotation. You want to attack with Badu while setting up your Dracloaks and that kind of stuff. This deck is really nice because I think it has a much more balanced way to play the game. It can control the tempo. It doesn't have very candy. It is still a bit slower. It's like a well-oiled machine. Your opponent knows what it's going to do, but it's very difficult for you to actually stop it, because there's just a lot of things that this deck has going for it. It has, a built-in draw engine that is super consistent. It has good ways to heal and maintain itself, alive. It has a good way to slow down the game with the Badu. It has great counters to stuff that would, in other words, be difficult to play around, which would be the bombs and Dusk Noirs and stuff, and Shaman to protect you from like the Water Ogre and the Starmies and the Grimmsnarls and stuff like that. Then you have Clefairy, which can be a really nice low-cost attacker against against many different decks, same as the Moltres. And then you have Unfair Stamp, which is just the best spec in the game right now, and Risky Ruins, which is kind of like a Hawlucha replacement. Because with Risky Ruins, whenever you bench any basic non-dark Pokemon, but for this deck, it's basically the Munkidori, because you use them at the same time. You bench the Munkidori, it takes 20 damage because of the Risky Ruins, because whenever you bench a non-dark Pokemon, it takes 2 damage. Then you can attach a Dark Energy to your Munkidori using Crispin or just from hand, and then you get to move that 2 damage. And when you get to move that 2 damage, well, Phantom Dive now is doing 200 damage to the active, and if you put 2 damage on, let's say, a bench Dreepy, now you can go ahead and Phantom Dive that Dreepy and knock it out, and maybe put 10 extra damage on another Dreepy to prep it for a future turn. So it is really nice into a lot of different decks. This is really good against Lucario as well, because Riolus have 80 HPs, and also a lot of Pokemon nowadays are being brought out with 80 HP, so the 2 damage is actually super important. I'll take a look at a few cards in depth in this list, but I'm not going to go over everything because, you know, that's what the guide is for. And it is my job, so I do have to make money somehow. So, yeah. So, obviously, we do play for Dreepy because it is the, you know, main consistency engine for our deck. The same reason we play 4 Dracloaks. And we do play 3 Dragapults. Straight Dragapult doesn't really have that many, you know, moving parts. It is like a little bit more, I guess it is a little bit of a toolbox, because Dragapult is your main attacker. However, you do have other attackers such as Moltres and the Clefairy, and that is really important to remember. However, Dragapult is still the main attacker, so you do want to find it quite consistently, and making sure you don't, like, you know, prize 2 Dragapults and just lose the game from there. You don't really want to put Clefairy into play a lot of the games, or some games, some matchups you really don't want Clefairy, so you would rather just attack with Dragapult, and, you know, 3 Dragapult is just quite nice. So, the Moltres is a tech that I was talking about. Although it is not in the initial list, it is amazing tech inclusion that helps into many matchups, the main ones being Mega Box, Raging Bolt, and the Ogerpon box, like with the basic EX box, basically. And it can also set up bigger KOs because you can swing into something like a Absol, for example, do 110 damage, your opponent can't really heal it because there's no Penny or Turo or anything like that, and then from there, Dragapult will come in and finish that knockout. As for what to cut, I'll probably be cutting the Shaman or the Psyduck, depending on the meta. Now, let's take a look at the Pult Noir version of the deck. Obviously, something that is quite important, like notice in this list, is that it is not playing the Clefairy. And I would say the main reason for not playing the Clefairy is because you play a very heavy, you play very heavily into the Briar. Briar is your main, like, win con in this deck. That is also why you are not playing the Ursaluna. So Briar is incredibly strong, and we will get to why I think it is so strong very shortly. So, obviously, Dragapult has, like we said, a great attack that can spread a lot of damage. And the nice thing is that you have a lot of agency over where this damage goes. And when you have Dusclops and Dusknoir, you have even more agency on where you place damage, when you take knockouts, and who you take knockouts on. So, the nice thing is that since a lot of decks are playing liabilities like Meowth and stuff like that, it is very easy for Dusknoir to come in, pop 130 damage on a Meowth, and then Dragapult can go ahead and Phantom Dive something else in the active spot, and go ahead and also put another 40 damage counters onto the Meowth to take a knockout there, and you're essentially trading 1 prize for 2 prize because of the Meowth. So there are a few ways you can, like, take all 6 prize cards with this deck, and then Dusknoir does help out a lot with that. So let's take, for example, we're playing against Raging Bolt. Raging Bolt, for example, let's say they have a Teal Mask Ogerpon in the active. We swing 200 damage into that Teal Mask Ogerpon, so that Teal Mask Ogerpon has 10 HP left, and then what can we do from there? Let's say they have a Fan Rotom as well, so we've gusted up a Teal Mask Ogerpon, we've done 200 damage to it, then we put 60 damage onto a Fan Rotom on the bench, leaving it with 10 HP as well. Then on the following turn, we can go ahead and use Dusknoir to, you know, pop into a Meowth, for example, so that'll leave it on 40 HP, right, like we've said already. And then we can use either Dusclops or Dusknoir. There'll probably be a Raging Bolt in the active. We can pop that into the active, leaving it with less than 200 HP, which is important. Use our Briar, right, which means now if our Dragapult takes a knockout on the active Pokemon, it'll take an extra prize card, only if our opponent is on 3 or only if our opponent is on exactly 2 prize cards, so that's why we are really leaning into the Dusclops and Dusknoir, so that we can, you know, pop enough of them so that it forces our opponent to be on 2 prize cards. If they're on 3 prize cards at the time, we can pop just the 1. If they're on 4 prize cards at the time, we can pop both into just random things. We just need to make sure we're knocking out the Raging Bolt, and then from there, we'll knock out the Raging Bolt in the active for 3 prize cards, and then we'll put 10 damage onto the Ogerpon for 2 more prize cards, and we'll put 10 damage onto the Fanrotom for 1 more prize card, totaling 6 prize cards in a single turn. You can also have a play like this, for example, without using the Briar, because, for example, if we do that exact same Phantom Dive play where we go 200 into a Teal Mask Ogerpon and 60 into a Fanrotom, leaving them both with, like we've already said, 10 HP, and then we, on the following turn, go Dusknoir into a Meowth, for example, and we leave the Meowth on 40 HP. Let's go 40 HP there. And then if we use our Risky Ruins Monkey Dory, we can, let's say, not put a Pheasantipity down to, you know, less than 200 HP, sorry. So what we have is a Pheasantipity active. We've bossed up a Pheasantipity, so we're knocking out the Pheasantipity for 2 prize cards because we're doing 200 damage there. Then we're putting 10 damage counters of our 60 onto the Ogerpon to knock it out. We're putting 10 damage counters of our 50 remaining onto the Fanrotom to knock it out, and then we're putting our remaining 40 onto the 40 HP left of the Meowth to knock it out, taking 6 prize cards in a single attack. Obviously, we did have to prepare this attack 1 turn previously, but this is a way we can just straight up win the game, right? And it's not like this isn't, you know, doable. Something that is really strong in this deck that helps us with these really intricate prize map and really intricate combos is something that you will notice that in a lot of decks play a 1/1 Noctowl. So the 1/1 Hutu Noctowl is super important in a deck like this that, you know, relies on very specific cards and very specific combos. After our Badoo dies, we usually replace that with a Hoothoot. Usually, what you would do in Straight Pult and stuff like that after your Badoo dies is you replace it with a Dreepy. However, since this deck is a little bit more aggressive and you don't really want to build up into another Dracloak, and Dracloak just draws you 2 random cards, you want to have a little bit more agency. So, since you're going to be, you know, we don't have any other attackers, we are always going for Dragapult. We are playing 3-Ray Candy, meaning we are usually going to have Dragapult established. That means, once we have Dragapult established, we can then use our Noctowl to go ahead and get whatever we need to pull off those kinds of plays. We can go ahead and grab a Pokepad and a Ray Candy if we need. We can go ahead and grab a Boss and a Ray Candy. And the nice thing is that we have so much draw power. We have, you know, Pheasantipity to draw us 3 cards before we use the Noctowl. We have, let's say, 2 or 3 Dracloaks to draw us 4 or 6 more cards. We have Meowth, which can search us out like a Boss's Orders or something like that, or the Briar or whatever. And then after we do all of that, we can use Noctowl to grab those 2 remaining pieces. It is also just a nice way in other matchups to be able to find Unfair Stamp and have agency over that. So this is a very intricate deck, and I think it is a very difficult deck to play properly post-rotation, but I think it definitely has one of the highest power caps out of basically any deck. So, like I've said, Noctowl is super strong. It might seem like an odd inclusion, but it lets us get really aggro, chain together combos that usually Dragapult shouldn't be able to do. And with Pokeball, Noctowl is fairly easy to find, you know, throughout the game. Another card that we've said already is super strong is this deck plays 2 of them, is the Meowth. Meowth is more of a requirement in this deck as a card because we use it to close out. We use, you know, Briar to close out the game more often. So we'll usually use a Meowth early to set up our board, or maybe get a Boss's Orders early, and then at the end of the game, we will also use another Meowth to either get the Briar or Boss's Orders to close out the game. So it helps us set up the game, and also helps us close the game. And the last deck we're looking at today is Terrapult. Terrapult is one of the most fun decks I have played, well, ever. So this deck does remind me of the Charizard Dawnzard version of that deck pre-rotation. However, you know, I think it might be a little bit stronger because it's centered around Dragapult, and Dragapult is just better than Charizard. I'm sorry, but it just is. And this deck has some really, really great attacking options into the meta. Against a lot of decks that don't play Shaman, Water Ogerpon is incredibly powerful. And you might be thinking, well, we don't play any Water Energy, how are we ever going to power up that guy? Well, because this is one of the only decks in the game that doesn't play Unfair Stamp as the ace spec. In fact, we play Sparkling Crystal, and Sparkling Crystal is super powerful in a deck like this, where we can attach it to Water Ogerpon. We can then use Crispin to go 2 energy to the Water Ogerpon and start swinging from as early as turn 2. And this is the only Dragapult deck that wants to really go first, I would say. The other Dragapult decks don't mind going first, but this one wants to blind pick first every single time because it is a Terra version of the deck, meaning on your second turn you want to be using Noctowls. And the Wellspring Ogerpon is really good at punishing slower opponents and also punishing, lower HP Pokemon. And since Countercatch and Iono aren't really in the game right now, you can get away with this a lot more. Arven isn't in the game. Lots of decks won't really have that option to find that Unfair Stamp turn 2. And even if they do, you do have great answers to that, as you do have a passive draw engine, being the Tricloak, seeing the top 2 cards every single turn. You set up multiple of these every single game. And you have the active search engine, which is the Noctowl Hoothoot, which searches out whatever you need. So this deck can push out some really interesting combos, being able to very consistently get turn 2, Candy Dragapult with Crispin, or Candy Dragapult with Boss's Orders plus Energy Search and Sparkling Crystal to punish things like that. This deck also doesn't play the Monkey Dory because usually you just want to go for that 2/2/2 prize map line, and Dragapult is able to go for a kind of like a more 0/4/2 line. But, over these turns, it is quite important to go 0/4, because on this turn, it means you aren't giving your opponent access to Pheasantipity or Unfair Stamp, and on this turn, you're crippling their entire board state, which is super nice. But this deck also does have other options just to go 2/2/2. In fact, a lot of matchups, you won't actually ever evolve into Dragapult. Your just matchup will consist of Wellspring for 2, Clefairy for 2, Blood Moon Osaluna for 2, Sinus Slip. And against a lot of decks that do play Teal'c Ogerpon, Teal'c Ogerpon is one of the most popular cards in the format right now. Well, Moltres is really good at dealing with that as well. So you have a lot of agency over what you can do and when you can do it with this deck, and I think this deck is my favorite of the 3. I think Straight Pult is the strongest. Consistently, I think it is the strongest. I think Terra, and I think Dragapult Dust Noir has the highest skill, Out of these 3 decks, I think straight Dragapult is the most consistent version, the one that kind of just does what it needs to do. I think Dragapult Dust Noir is the one with the highest power cap. I think if it does function, it just runs really hard at times. And I think Terra is the most into the meta, adaptable, really good into a lot of different things, really fun and super explosive as well. So all 3 of these decks are really fun. So Dragapult is just really good. Which of these 3 versions will you be using? And if you want to learn about any of these 3 versions, please, go ahead down below and I'll leave a link to the guide. If you guys enjoyed the video, please do like and subscribe. It helps out the channel a lot. And I will be seeing you very soon for a lot of post-rotation content. I am so happy to finally be in this new era of the Pokemon TCG, and I'm sure you guys are excited to play these new decks as well. So I'll see you guys around. Peace.